if the pastors are DJs, their places of worship are clubs, and we're coming to clubs next. And I know we're going to say, I can say QVT again, can I? We're going to cue some of the images from the club scene now. And so coming back from DJs, great clubs. They're the first, once we found our records and found this and stuff, the places we go community to meet other people who like the same music are clubs. And you've identified some cracking clubs here that you're going to take us through here. But just maybe set the scene on club culture, why you've picked these clubs as so groundbreaking, and then we'll have a little exploration in the club and club nights.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of these places are kind of the dugout in Bristol, which was just a little hole in Bristol that evolved that whole kind of sound that Massive Attack, Tricky, and all these people came out of in the 80s. And that was just like kind of off the beaten track in a rough area, a broken down place. You know, you have those kind of clubs. And then by the same token, you have like your specially built mega, I mean, the Saints, that's New York. The Saint was like a gay club that held close on 3,000 people. There was a planetarium in there. It was like a huge scene. It was a predominantly white clientele. At the same time, you had Paradise Garage, which catered mainly for the black clientele, or other clubs as well, but, you know, to simplify it. But the Saints, was quite sad with the Saints when AIDS kind of struck and everything, before people knew what it was, before they had a term for it, people were starting to die. And so many people were dying that went to this club that for a period of time, they were calling it Saints disease. And, it was kind of never the same, obviously, after that, the devastation that had been caused. But, you know, this club was apparently just out of this world, you know.
Well, so I mean, clubs, trust me, and I'd like to touch on DJs and clubs, so because and particularly then we're going to touch on records. So records are made for radio play, 7-inch. Suddenly, there's records made just for clubs. And just for a club dance floor, and they were longer, and they were in the environment, great sound and great lighting. Now you've picked a great variety of Studio 54 to the Blitz and stuff. A little bit more maybe in some of the clubs you picked here, and why did you pick them, and some anecdotes around those would be great, Greg.
Well, I mean, there's the Powerhouse, the Birmingham club from the early to mid 80s, which is very rarely mentioned, but they had these incredible all-dayers that's the top DJs from the North and from London, people from London like Paul Murphy, Trouble Anderson, Cleveland Anderson, you know, from the North, Colin Curtis, I did it myself, you know. And these all-dayers went on. Basically, there was generally an all-dayer most Sundays that you could get to somewhere in the North and Midlands, or if you live down south around London, Essex way. And, you know, they brought together these different factions of the scene, and it helped cross-pollinate the whole thing. They ran from 2 o'clock in the afternoon till midnight on a Sunday or a bank holiday Monday. And the Powerhouse was a very famous, one of the final famous all-dayers where, you know, the electro sound was coming through. It was again a predominantly black audience. And it's rarely mentioned, but people in Birmingham, you know, that's their Studio 54 in a sense. You know.
Yeah.
So, you know, all these different kind of venues occur, like for different reasons. Like, as I said before about the scene in London, in Ham Yard, it's only a small place in Soho, but the influence that it would have from that grouping of people that went there, and then people like Roger Eagle wanting to do that similar thing in Manchester. And from the Twisted Wheel, after Roger Eagle's time, it moved premises, and Northern Soul came out of that venue. And the reason it did was that as it moved towards the end of the 60s into the 70s, and the sound was changing, and the music was more funk-based that was coming through, the people that went to the Wheel, which was still a mod crowd, whereas in London, a lot of the original mods had kind of grown their hair and got into psychedelic, or cut their hair off and become skinheads, you know, as a reaction. So, but in Manchester and in parts of the North, it was different. The mod scene continued through. The scooters were still out. The Wheel was the place to be. It was the main place in that part of the country. And a DJ, actually, he was from Wolverhampton, called Farmer Carl Dean. He brought down some records that were maybe 5 or 6 years old, and they started playing them in the wheel, and they blew up. And eventually, Tammy Lynn, I'm Going to Run Away From You was one of these tracks that went in the charts. And then Hey Girl, Don't Bother Me by the Tams went to number one. You know, I think it was a 1963 track, and so that went number one, I think, in about 71, you know, so the record companies became aware that these older records could sell again. And at the same time, the people who were going to these clubs, they wanted to find rarer records. And what their thing was that mid-60s Motown sound. They never let go of it. They loved that sound, and they weren't going for the newer sounds. And so they started to dig out and realize that in Detroit, while Motown was going on, all this amazing music was coming out, there were dozens and dozens of labels trying to do Motown type tracks, and then in other cities too. And so people went digging for these rare tracks that sounded like these mid-60s Motown records. And this is the origin of Northern Soul. And strangely, the guy that actually he coined Tamla Motown, a guy called Dave Godin, who basically started in the UK the Tamla Motown Appreciation Society and got the label going as one label, because it was previously licensed to different labels like Stateside and London and stuff. As Tamla Motown, this institution started. He was the same guy that coined the term Northern Soul, and he had a record shop in London. And what he'd noticed was on football days, where there was loads of like football fans coming up, some would pop in the shop, buy a particular type of sound,
the harder edged kind of, was it? Yeah,
that he called Northern Soul.
Yeah.
And you know, and so, you know, it came out of you know, these different factions and things that have been going on for a number of years previous to that. It wasn't something that...
It's amazing, actually, just touching out, there should be another adjunct, which would be the record shops involved. Just to dwell a little bit further on the advancements of dance music and dance culture, the importance of clubs played in that, Greg. So I know myself, when I started clubbing and stuff, it was gay clubs I went to, whether it was Sides in Dublin or Heaven or Trade in London, and the importance of gay and black culture developing dance music. And I know you touched on Saints, but kind of outsider clubs, outsider folk and outsider music, and that importance for club culture, and not only club culture, but the development of dance culture and dance music, Greg.
Well, definitely. I mean, if you go back to The Loft and David Mancuso, and the audience that you had, which was a mixture of black, white, gay, straight, you were welcome if you brought the right vibe in with you. And, you know, it was out of, like anything, it's out of these fusions and cross-pollination of ideas and people coming together that new, you know, directions emerge. You know, eventually later in the decade, originally, you know, the gay scene was listening to the same music that was being listened to by straight people, you know, going to clubs. It was just this great kind of black American music. And then like early 70s, like Philadelphia and the music that was coming out of there. So it was only later, once disco became this huge juggernaut, that it's specified into different areas, and a more kind of gay come high energy aspects kind of came into place. So by the time you get to the Saints, the music that you're going to get in that club is going to be almost completely different to what you're getting in Paradise Garage, which is much more connected to black music. You know, it's coming from that side. So there's no set way, you know, that it went, but you know, it splinters off like towards the end of the...
Well, it does. And then it was kind of crazy because, I mean, my partying was served up in a field or in a warehouse or in a kind of in the warehouse scene in the late 80s, and acid house and that kind of explosion. And then I was trying to recall, and God rest his soul, was Andy Weatherall. I was kind of recalling great clubs. I went like Sabre Sonic in London and Tooley Street. It was absolutely amazing. But the Ministry of Sound, I remember the Ministry of Sound first opened. It was a fantastic club, you know, it was absolutely, it was great sounds and great stuff. But the kind of super club kind of overtook itself, Greg, I think, in modern times now. I'm unsure really if it's, well, we can't even get back into the clubs anymore, but I'm unsure if its role it plays now. It kind of lost its way a bit from these halcyon days we're talking about here.
Well, I mean, you can never go back to things. Things evolve and change, and an industry grows. So you can't recreate what went back then. I mean, you know, you can maybe do it on a nostalgia trip, or you can,
I see someone's just dropped in the end as well, and Bagley's and all these grains and these great clubs and trade and stuff like that. Wow. So that is the end of, we're halfway through, folks. We're halfway through this interview piece here, and we've just completed our little journey of club culture. I beg your pardon, clubs.